I kept the file on my desk for 11 days before I opened it. That is not how I normally operate. I have been a compliance liaison for the Joint Treaty Commission for 19 years. In that time, I have processed 4,200 audit requests, cross-referenced 800,000 pages of treaty instrument, and closed 217 formal inquiries without a single procedural reversal on appeal. I do not let files sit. I do not let problems breathe longer than necessary. I open things when they arrive, I log them, I assess the scope, I begin the response. That is the discipline this work requires, and it is the discipline I have applied for the full 19 years without deviation. But this one I left on the corner of my desk, face down under a coffee mug I stopped using, and I went about my work as though it were not there. My name is Harlan Webb. I was, at the time of the events I am about to describe, the senior compliance officer attached to the human delegation at the Joint Treaty Commission's 9th floor offices on Relay Station Venn. I had been in the position for 6 years. Before that, I spent 7 years as a field auditor, traveling to signatory facilities across 11-star systems to verify compliance records against treaty standards. Before that, I spent 5 years as a legal interpreter seconded to the Interstellar Senate, which is where I learned, properly, at the level of fluency, how institutional bodies work, what they want when they speak in formal procedural language, and what they want even more when they dress that wanting up as something neutral and call it a routine review. The file was not routine. It had arrived through the standard diplomatic courier channel, stamped with the Commission's seal and marked review. Compliance audit, Earth. Signatory block, no priority flag, no accompanying note, just the file, the seal, and a requested response window of 90 standard days. In the ordinary course of things, I would have opened it within the hour, logged the incoming, identified the scope, flagged items requiring legal team coordination, and begun preparing the response materials. That is the ordinary course of things, and I know it well. But I recognize the signature on the authorization block. Counselor Examiner Dova Sen of the VETH Compact. Third-ranked compliance examiner in the Commission's history by case closure rate. Lead auditor on the Heron expulsion, the TOLA sanction review, and the infamous MECAR deregistration. 3 of the largest punitive findings in the Commission's recorded history. The Heron expulsion had removed an entire species from the protected signatory role on the strength of her report alone. One report, 7 months of work, 63 pages of findings, and a species that had been a treaty participant for 200 years, found itself outside the framework with no recourse. The TOLA sanction had resulted in a 40-year trade interdiction that had effectively severed a system from the broader, galactic commercial network. The effects of that interdiction were still being felt in the generation that grew up under it. The MECAR deregistration had ended MECAR's existence as an independent political entity within the galactic framework. They were now an administrative zone of the Hegemonic Compact, which was almost exactly what the Hegemonic Compact had been maneuvering toward for decades. She did not run routine reviews. She ran final ones. There was a specific quality to her institutional record that people in this work recognized from a distance, the way you recognize the shape of a particular kind of weather on the horizon before you can identify the clouds. You did not send Dova Sen to verify that everything was in order. The Commission had hundreds of examiners for that kind of work. You sent her when you had reason to believe that something was significantly wrong, and you needed a finding that would be unimpeachable under every challenge that followed, for as long as the record lasted. Her name in the authorization block meant that whoever had dispatched this inquiry expected to find something. They expected to find something serious. I left the file on the desk for 11 days. I thought about what it meant that she had been assigned. I thought about who had authorized the assignment, the third compliance chamber, which was on the authorization block. But the third chamber did not write request language like this. The mutual transparency clause framing alone was more precise than the third chamber's typical vocabulary, which meant someone with more sophisticated legal staff had drafted the scope and routed it through the chamber for authorization. I thought about the theocratic conclave of the VETH Compact, which had been pressing for a formal review of Earth's treaty standing for 8 years, and had never had the votes in any commission body to force one. I thought about the third compliance chamber being, of the Commission's 5 bodies, the one where VETH influence was strongest. And I thought about what happens when a body that has been blocked in the main chambers spends 8 years looking for a path through the procedural structure and finally finds one. I had a very long dinner at the station's lower deck canteen on the second evening after the file arrived. I ate half of it. I slept badly. I lay in my quarters and listened to the station's ventilation cycle and ran through the compliance numbers from memory. The instruments, the thresholds, the gray areas I had been managing for 6 years, the specific provisions that the conclave's legal staff would target if they were trying to construct a finding. I knew most of those numbers well enough to recite them in order. What I could not calculate, lying there in the dark, was the examiner herself, what Sen would do with what she found. Whether the ambiguities in the mutual transparency clause would read the way our legal team had assessed them, or whether a different reading was available and she would take it. In the morning I opened the file. The scope was broad. It was the broadest audit scope I had seen directed at a human signatory in 19 years of compliance work. They wanted a full review of Earth's compliance with 17 separate treaty instruments, the Venn Accords on force limitation, the Meridian Protocols on weapons development and stockpile disclosure, the Charter of Signatory Conduct governing diplomatic representation, the Intersystem Transit Agreements, the Commercial Navigation Rules, the Mutual Transparency Clause requiring signatories to make military assets available for review upon request, the Settled Systems Environmental Compliance Framework, the Non-Signatory Species Treatment Protocols, the Commercial Exclusion Zones Agreement, and 8 others, covering everything from the procedural rules governing human diplomatic personnel to the conditions under which Earth bloc entities could operate in disputed transit corridors. They wanted a compliance record going back 30 years. They wanted full access to our asset registries, our fleet manifests, our research logs, our treaty correspondence, our administrative records, and our diplomatic personnel files. They wanted Examiner Sene to have unrestricted movement within Earth block space during the review period. They wanted a response to any findings within 60 days of report submission. They wanted everything, framed as a routine review, authorized by a woman who had never in her career produced a report that did not end a career, a treaty, or a civilization standing in the galactic community. I read the file 3 times. The first time I read it looking for the specific thing they were after, the instrument they were betting on, the provision they expected to yield a finding. The second time I mapped the full terrain, reading each instrument's scope against my knowledge of our compliance record, noting where we were solid and where we had the gray areas. The third time I read it slowly, word by word, the way you read something when you need to understand it completely before you decide what to do. I sent a brief message to Ambassador Petra Valdez. The message said, "We have received an audit request. I believe you should read it before your morning briefing. I will be at my desk." Ambassador Valdez arrived at my office 22 minutes later. She had been in diplomatic service for 31 years, longer than I had been working in any professional capacity, longer than many of the instruments we were being asked to comply with had been in force. She read the file standing up, coat still on, one hand flat on the edge of my desk. She read it without comment. She turned every page. She went back to the authorization block at the end and read the examiner's name and the chamber authorization and the scope summary. Then she set the file down, smoothed it flat with one hand and said, "Who drafted the Mutual Transparency Clause framing? Not the third chamber." I said, "The language precision suggests conclave legal staff. I think the scope was drafted outside the chamber and routed through it for authorization. How long have they been building toward this? 8 years by the public record. Possibly longer in private." She picked up the file and went back to the scope section and read it once more. She was quiet for long enough that I had time to think about the particular quality of her silence. It was the silence of someone who had already understood the problem and was working ahead of it, not the silence of someone still catching up. She set the file down again. "What are our actual compliance numbers?" I had run them in my head for 11 days. Across all 17 instruments, we are compliant on 16. The 17th, the Mutual Transparency Clause, has a gray area involving certain research facilities in the outer settlements that have not been formally classified for disclosure. Our legal team has assessed that the exemption language covers them. It is not a violation. It is an ambiguity in the instrument language that resolves in our favor under any reasonable construction. But it is the kind of ambiguity that a skilled examiner can characterize differently if she is inclined to. Is Sene inclined? I do not know how Sene is inclined. I know what her record shows. Her record shows that she writes what the evidence supports. She does not manufacture findings, but she is extraordinarily thorough, and her threshold for what counts as a disclosure failure under ambiguous instrument language may not be identical to ours. Ambassador Valdez looked at me for a moment. "What do they expect to find?" "The Outer Settlement Research Network," I said. "That is what the Mutual Transparency Clause framing is targeting. They know it exists. They may not know its full scope, but they know enough to know it is larger than our formal disclosures reflect. They expect Sen to examine it, find the undisclosed portions, and characterize the failure to disclose as a violation of the clause." Valdez nodded. She put on her coat fully and picked up her briefing folder. "Cooperate fully. Give her everything she asks for. Schedule the access reviews at her convenience. Assign her a liaison, you, not a junior, and pull the compliance documentation for all 17 instruments and have it ready before she arrives. Complete documentation. Not the minimum, everything. And the outer settlement facilities. Make them available, all 47. I looked at her. That is a significant posture, she said. It is the only posture. If we conceal anything, if Sen finds one thing we did not volunteer, one thing she had to dig for, one thing we held back by a single day, we hand them the story they want to tell. We become the party that had something to hide. That is their real goal. Not just a technical finding, a posture of concealment, an appearance of guilt. That is what keeps an inquiry open, expands the scope, pulls in the larger compliance council, turns 90 days into 3 years. She's straightened. We give her everything. We answer every question before she asks it. We make her job so complete and so easy that her report writes itself from the record we provide, and what it writes is the record as it actually is. Full compliance, fully documented, fully disclosed on request. She picked up her coat, but understand what we are doing. We are not simply being cooperative because we have nothing to hide. We are being cooperative with a specificity and a completeness that communicates something. We want Sin to understand, from the moment she walks into the archive room, that the documentation she is about to examine reflects work that was done carefully over a very long period of time by people who took the treaty framework seriously. We want her to understand that before she reads a single document, I said, and if she understands it and writes it in her report, then she writes what we have actually built, and the record stands on what we have actually built. Set up the welcome briefing for when she arrives. I will attend personally. She left. I sat at my desk for a while, then I began preparing. The preparation took the full 14 days before Sene arrived. Our legal team had 12 people, and I had all of them working on documentation organization from the day after I briefed them. We organized the compliance records for all 17 instruments into a coherent archive, not just the required 30 years, but the full 50 years of Earth's treaty participation, arranged by instrument, cross-referenced by provision, annotated with the specific treaty language that applied to each data point. We flagged every ambiguity, assessed it, and included the legal team's written assessment of how it resolved and why. We prepared supplementary documentation for any provision where the base record was accurate, but might benefit from additional context. For the Outer Settlement Research Network specifically, I had each of the 47 facility administrators contacted personally by my office. I told them to prepare their full archive for examination. Every project log, every research manifest, every administrative decision, every output record going back to each facility's founding. I told them the examiner would have unrestricted access to every room and every file. I told them I expected the same quality of cooperation that we were providing at the commission level. Most of them understood without needing further instruction. The Outer Settlement Research community had been operating under a specific kind of awareness for a long time, an awareness that their work existed in a legal space that was legitimate but that required, precisely because it was legitimate, a documentation standard that could absorb examination without flinching. They had been building that standard for as long as they had been operating under the exemption. Some of the administrators I spoke with had been managing their documentation protocols for longer than I had been with the commission. They knew what was at stake and they knew how to prepare for it. I also prepared, on my own initiative, a summary document of the aggregate research network. 30 pages, 11 categories: propulsion research, materials science, propellant efficiency and energy systems, communications architecture, structural engineering, autonomous systems development, medical applications, energy storage, atmospheric processing technology, remote sensing, and the category that our legal team had, with careful precision, labeled defensive application research. I had our legal team review the summary for accuracy. It took them 3 days to verify it against the source records, which they did, because the summary was going to be the document I gave Sene when she asked for it and I wanted it to be exact. Dova Sen arrived on Relay Station Ven 14 days after I began preparing. I was at the docking platform when her shuttle cleared the pressure lock. She was shorter than I had expected from her institutional record, compact and precisely organized in her movement, carrying a leather satchel that looked as though it had been through 30 years of this work alongside her. She traveled with 2 junior examiners, a Veth male named Oren and a Keth female named Savi, both carrying case files, both moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had been in the field, often enough that arrival at a new station was simply the beginning of the next task. No personal staff, no advisors. She did not bring anyone she did not need. She looked at me across the platform with the wide-set amber eyes of Veth physiology. She took me in with a thoroughness that took about 2 seconds and told me she had read my personnel file before she came. Webb, Examiner Sen, welcome. On behalf of Ambassador Valdez and the human delegation, Our facilities and archives are available to you without restriction for the duration of your review. We have prepared full documentation for all 17 instruments. The ambassador is available to meet with you at your convenience. She studied me for a moment. All 17 instruments. All 17, plus supplementary documentation we thought might be useful. We can go over the archive organization whenever you are ready. Something adjusted in her expression. Not surprise, a calibration. A small revision to a prior estimate. When can I begin? This afternoon, if you prefer, she said. This afternoon. I have been asked to describe what it was like to work alongside Dova Sen for 35 days. I have given that question more thought than most questions I have been asked in my professional life, because the honest answer requires precision in several different directions at once. She was the best examiner I had ever encountered. I had worked alongside senior auditors in the field years, people with 20 and 25-year careers, people whose names carried the same institutional weight that Senni's carried. She was better than all of them. Not dramatically better. The difference at that level of skill is always in degree rather than kind. But the degree was significant, and it was consistent across the full 35 days of the review. The thoroughness was the first thing I noticed. She read every document fully, not just the salient sections. She retained specific provisions, dates, and cross-references accurately enough to surface inconsistencies without returning to her notes, which meant she was building a continuous working picture of the compliance record as she went, rather than reviewing documents in isolation. Her 2 junior examiners were capable professionals, but they were extensions of her methodology rather than independent contributors to the analysis. She assigned them targeted tasks and verified their outputs herself, incorporating nothing into her assessment that she had not independently confirmed. She was also faster than I expected, not rushed. There was nothing careless in how she worked, and she never moved on from a document before she had taken from it what it contained. But the speed at which she processed a page of treaty-adjacent compliance documentation and correctly identified its relevance to the instrument at hand told me that she had reviewed enough similar records that the pattern of compliant documentation was deeply familiar to her. What she was doing, I think, was not reading for comprehension. She already comprehended the standard. She was reading for deviation from it, and when she found none, when the documentation was exactly what treaty-compliant documentation looks like, organized the way it should be organized, referencing the provisions it should reference, cross-checked against the standards that apply, she moved on quickly, because there was nothing there to hold her attention. In the first 3 days she cleared 6 of the standard instruments. The Venn Accords, the Meridian Protocols, the Charter of Signatory Conduct, the Intersystem Transit Agreements, the Commercial Navigation Rules, the Non-Signatory Species Treatment Protocols, full compliance across all 6. The documentation was in order. It was not merely in order, it was organized with a completeness that I could see, from the length of time she spent on each section before moving on. She had not been expecting. On the morning of the 4th day, she looked up from the Venn Accords compliance record and said, without inflection, that our documentation extended to 50 years rather than the 30 she had requested. The treaty instrument covers 50 years of signatory participation, I said. We organized the compliance record to match the instrument record, she said. Most signatories provide the minimum requested range. We thought the full range would be more useful to your review. She considered that for a moment. Then she went back to the document. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the 6 standard instruments and begun work on the remaining 11. I watched her work through the Commercial Exclusion Zones Agreement on a Thursday afternoon and noted the point at which she paused on a section that had a minor historical ambiguity. A 3-year period in which our compliance record showed a gap that was explained by the gap being the period during which the instrument itself was being renegotiated, and the prior version was technically in abeyance. The gap was documented in our materials with the full negotiation timeline included. She read the documentation, cross-referenced it against the timeline, verified the abeyance period against the Commission's public record, and moved on. She spent 4 minutes on it. A less thorough examiner might have spent 4 days. That was the pattern of the first week. She found the compliance record to be, in every place she looked, what it actually was. And what it actually was clean. I reported to Ambassador Valdez each evening. The reports were brief. She had asked me to flag anything that raised concern, and for the first week there was nothing to flag. She received each report with the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for something they have prepared for and who understands that waiting is part of the preparation. On the 6th day of the review, Sen turned to the outer settlement facilities. I had arranged the access personally and completely. I drove her to the first facility myself in a commissioned transport, a materials science installation in the outer belt of the Fenwick station. cluster, formally classified under the Meridian Protocol's broad research exemption. The exemption had been negotiated into the original instrument as a recognition that signatories required the ability to conduct advanced research without the friction of pre-disclosure review, provided the research operated within certain scope limitations, and the records were made available upon request. The scope limitations were defined in language that was ambiguous in specific ways that our legal team had spent considerable time analyzing. The analysis held we were inside the limitation under any reasonable construction of the text. What the exemption did not require was unsolicited disclosure. We had not hidden anything. We had operated under a legitimate exemption, documented our work, and not volunteered the documentation to parties who had not requested it. The distinction between concealment and non-advertisement is a real one in treaty compliance law, and it was a distinction we had been careful about for a long time. Sen walked through the first facility for 4 hours. She was thorough in a way that went beyond the procedural. She was not simply verifying that the records were organized as required. She was understanding the work. She asked the facility administrator questions about the specific research programs, about the technical applications of the materials being studied, about the relationship between the theoretical research and potential practical outcomes. The administrator answered clearly and completely. I had briefed him on what I expected and he delivered it. Accurate, direct, without the defensive hedging that characterizes an organization that has something to protect. At the end of the 4 hours, Sen stood in the main archive room and looked at a wall of storage units. Floor-to-ceiling organized documentation, 30 meters of it, for a long moment. Then, how many facilities of this type exist in the outer settlements? 47 active research installations operating under the broad research exemption, I said, all with documentation prepared and available for review. I have access arrangements ready for all 47. She looked at me. The amber eyes did something I had not seen them do in 6 days of working alongside her. They adjusted, not surprise, assessment. The recalculation of a number that had just turned out to be significantly larger than the prior estimate. 47. 47 active installations. We can move through them in whatever order you prefer, she said. I will need to visit more than this one. Of course, I said. All 47 are available. She returned to her notes. I returned to watching her. Over the following 18 days, she visited 11 of the 47 facilities. She did not need all 47. I had known she would not, and she knew it too. Because the 11 she visited were sufficient to understand the full scope and character of the network. She chose them deliberately: a materials science facility, a propulsion research installation, 2 atmospheric processing stations, a communications architecture lab, a structural engineering facility, 2 energy systems installations, a remote sensing station, and the 2 largest of the defensive application research facilities. The moment I want to describe precisely occurred at the 7th facility, the propulsion research installation in the Calder settlement cluster. It was housed in a building that had been expanded 3 times over 30 years and now occupied a footprint that I had always found slightly surprising when I visited it in an official capacity, not because it was dramatic in its appearance, which it was not, but because the scale of it only registered when you were inside it, and the proportions of the active research bays became apparent. Sen was reading the technical manifest for the facility's current project list. The manifest was 70 pages. She had been reading it for about 20 minutes. Seated at the administrator's conference table with the document flat in front of her, and her notes to one side when she went still. It was gradual, the specific quality of attention deepening when it encounters the thing it was actually looking for, underneath all the things that merely looked like it. She sat for a moment without reading. Then she turned back 2 pages and read a specific section again. Then she looked up at the main assembly bay through the conference room's internal window, the full length of the bay visible, 12 active test platforms, the burn sequences running along the south wall, with the particular low-frequency vibration that you felt before you heard it. She looked at the bay for a moment. Then she looked back at the manifest. She said, "What is the total operational capacity represented by the research exemption installations?" It was shaped like a question. It was not quite a question. The combined output of the 47 installations, if fully integrated, would represent a significant expansion of current disclosed capabilities. The research outcomes across the full network have not been formally tabulated against treaty thresholds because no formal tabulation has been required under the exemption, she said. Has anyone tabulated them informally? Our legal team has prepared a summary document. I can make it available. Yes. I gave it to her that evening. 30 pages, 11 categories. I had prepared it before she arrived, knowing it would be requested at some point, and I had wanted it to be ready when she asked. She took it to her quarters. I know she read it that night because she requested 3 supplementary documents before the next morning. Documents that could only be identified if you had read the summary carefully and followed specific citations embedded in the analysis. I had all 3 waiting on her desk when she arrived. She looked at the documents, she looked at me. She picked them up and went to work without comment. I want to be precise about what she was finding, because it is important to what I am trying to put in the record. We had not violated the treaty. I mean that in the full substance of the thing, not the legal surface of it. Across 17 instruments, across 50 years of signatory participation, we had operated inside the framework. Every exemption we had used was legitimate. Every ambiguity we had interpreted in our favor had been assessed by our legal team under the applicable standard and found to resolve that way under reasonable construction. We had not manufactured compliance. We had not reverse-engineered the appearance of compliance onto activity that was actually non-compliant. We had built what we built, from the beginning, with the treaty framework in front of us, and we had built carefully enough that the thing we built was, in every verifiable particular, compliant. What we had not done was advertise the scope of what we had built. The framework did not require us to. The mutual transparency clause required disclosure upon request, not continuous unsolicited reporting of everything we were doing under the research exemption. We had made the facilities available. We had given Sen the summary document. We had answered every question before she finished asking it. That was the full extent of our obligation under the instrument, and we had met it completely. But the scope of what we had built, when fully assembled from all 47 facilities and all 11 categories of output, was large. The defensive application research alone, 14 pages of the 30-page summary, was large in a way that took a moment to absorb even when you had been working alongside it for 6 years. I had absorbed it in my first year in the role and had spent the subsequent 5 years understanding it more precisely with each annual review of the facilities and their progress. Sen was absorbing it in 35 days, which was faster than most people could have managed, and I could see in the last week of the review that she had absorbed it fully. She spent that final week in the archive room on Relay Station Ven, completing the cross-reference work on the outer settlement materials and working through the documentation for the 7 remaining standard instruments. She was quiet that week, professionally quiet, the quality of silence that belongs to focused work rather than suppressed reaction. Her 2 junior examiners handled the documentation on the remaining instruments while she concentrated on the synthesis of the larger analysis. I was present most of each day, available in case she needed anything, saying nothing that she had not first required. On the penultimate evening, she worked past the station's overnight shift change. The corridor outside the archive room went quiet around her. I brought coffee from the machine at the end of the hall and left a second cup near where she was working. She looked at it. She looked at me. She picked up the cup and went back to the document she was reading. I stayed in the corner of the room for another 2 hours. I had a brief that needed reading, an instrument revision comment due back to the Commission's first chamber, and I read it without retaining much of it, because I was paying more attention to the quality of the room than to the document in my hands. At some point past the station's midnight cycle, Sen paused her work and looked up at the narrow window that faced the outer docking ring. Through it you could see a section of the navigation field and, that evening, a number of outer settlement ships sitting at anchor in the transit lanes. Standard commercial traffic, nothing unusual. Ships that had been running those lanes for years. She looked at the window for a long time, long enough that I stopped pretending to read the brief and watched her directly. She was not looking at any particular ship. She was looking at the pattern of them, the density of the transit traffic, the settlement markers visible in the navigation field, the ordinary weight of human commercial movement through that part of space. She held it for a long time. Then she looked back at her documents and made a brief note, which I could not read from across the room, and returned to her work. I did not ask what she had written. I have thought about it since. On the last day of the formal review period, she asked to meet with Ambassador Valdez. The meeting took place in the ambassador's conference room. Sen came alone. Valdez had me present and 2 members of the legal team. Sen sat across the table, placed her satchel on the floor, and folded her hands in front of her. She was quiet for a moment, not gathering herself. She had arrived gathered, more like allowing the room to arrive at the same point she was already occupying. I have completed my review of the compliance record for all 17 instruments. Thank you for your thoroughness, Ambassador Valdez said. I have found no violations. Across all 17 instruments, no violations. No one at our side of the table said anything. It was not a statement that invited response. The Outer Settlement Research Network operates under a legitimate exemption. The exemption language is ambiguous, but the ambiguity resolves in the Earth block's favor under any reasonable construction of the text. The research outcomes documented across the network have not formally triggered disclosure thresholds under current instrument language. There are questions that could be raised about whether certain aggregate outputs might warrant a threshold review under a future instrument revision. Those are questions for a future process. They are not findings under the current instruments, and I will not characterize them as such. She paused. The room held its silence. I will file my report to the third compliance chamber, with a finding of full compliance across all 17 instruments, and a recommendation that the inquiry be formally closed. Ambassador Valdez said, "We appreciate your diligence, Examiner." Sensen looked at her. "I have one question, off the record if you are willing." "Of course." A moment of quiet. Then, "The aggregate output of your research network, across the 11 categories in your legal team's summary, have you assessed what it represents, relative to the current disclosed capabilities of other commission signatories?" Valdez said, "Our legal team has made assessments, and we believe our current compliance posture is appropriate under the treaty framework." Sen held the answer for a moment. She picked up her satchel and stood. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ambassador. It was the most complete cooperation I have encountered in 31 years of audit work." She left. I looked at Valdez after the door closed. She was looking at the table. She knows, Valdez said. "What she writes in the report and what she knows are different things. They always are." She looked up. "She is an honest examiner. An honest examiner writes what the evidence supports. The evidence supports full compliance. She will write full compliance and she will close the inquiry, because that is what her record shows, and that is what her record is." She gathered her papers. "Write up the cooperation summary for our files. Every document, every access, every answer. I want the record of this review to be as complete as the review itself." I went back to my desk and spent the rest of the afternoon writing it. 43 pages. Every document provided, every facility opened, every question answered. When I finished, I read it over once, then I filed it. The report arrived in the third compliance chamber's record 41 days later. 7 pages, 4 procedural, 2 compliance findings. Full compliance across all 17 instruments. No violations. The Outer Settlement Research Network operating within treaty parameters under the broad research exemption. No disclosure threshold formally triggered. Possible future instrument revision questions noted without prejudice. Current findings. 1 page, the recommendation. Formally close the inquiry. No further action required. 1 paragraph in the findings section noted that the human delegation had provided the most completely and proactively organized compliance documentation the examiner had encountered in her 31-year career, and recommended the delegation's documentation practices as a model for future signatory compliance records. I read that paragraph twice. Then I put the report in the archive. The third compliance chamber met 11 days after the report was filed. The session lasted 40 minutes. The report was formally accepted. The inquiry was formally closed. A motion to retain the matter for further review was raised by the Veth Compact's representative on the chamber. It failed to receive a second. In the chamber where Veth influence was strongest of any of the Commission's 5 bodies, no one seconded the motion. I thought about what that meant for a long time. It is worth recording what I think happened in that chamber. In those 40 minutes when the report landed on the table and was read by people who had spent 8 years building toward a different outcome. Sen's report said we were compliant. That was the finding. That was the record. You cannot dispute a finding of full compliance on the grounds that you expected to find something else. Not in a body that operates on procedural rules. You cannot dispute it when the examiner is the one you chose, when the documentation was provided voluntarily and completely by the party. Under review, when the examiner herself noted it as the most thorough cooperation of her career. You have no grounds. You have no motion that can survive even the first procedural challenge. Because the record is what it is and you cannot argue against a record you created. The motion failed. The inquiry closed. The record stood. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about what Sen found and what she understood about it, not the compliance findings. Those were clear, and she was too good at her work for them to be anything other than clear. I mean what she understood about what lay beneath the compliance. The full scope of the research network, the aggregate across 11 categories, the number she had arrived at in the archive room, sitting alone with the summary document, the supplementary materials, and 31 years of experience assessing treaty-relevant capabilities across multiple species. I think she had done the math herself. I think she had done it that last week in the archive room quietly, in the margins of the work she had been assigned to do, and the number she arrived at was large enough that she sat with it for a moment, before filing it in the place where you file conclusions that are outside the scope of your current assignment. Her assignment was compliance. The compliance was what it was. The number, what the compliance represented, what 50 years of careful documented work inside the framework had accumulated into, what it meant for the broader galactic balance that a signatory had spent that long building that particular architecture with that particular level of discipline. The number was not hers to report. She had been assigned to assess 17 instruments, and she assessed them, and she found full compliance, and she wrote full compliance, and she recommended closing the inquiry. That was the whole of it. I left the Joint Treaty Commission 4 years after the Senate review. I took a position advising the Outer Settlement Administrative Council on treaty compliance frameworks, which was quieter work. More reading and less institutional pressure, more time spent identifying provisions that were too ambiguous to be reliably enforced, less time spent in the architecture of response that the Commission required. I was good at it. I had spent 19 years learning to read treaty language the way it was actually written, rather than the way it was intended, and the gap between those two things was where the most consequential work in this field had always lived. I looked up Senna's record periodically in the years after. She continued working for the Commission for 9 more years before she retired. In those 9 years she produced 11 reports, 7 full compliance, 3 violations with formal sanctions, 1 partial compliance with an instrument revision recommendation. Her retirement notice listed her notable cases: the Heron expulsion, the Tolas sanction, the Mecker deregistration, and the others. It did not mention K2847, full compliance all instruments inquiry closed, the most complete cooperation encountered in 31 years. I sat with that for a moment. Then I filed the notice and went back to work. In the outer settlement clusters, the 47 facilities continued their work. The exemption language remained ambiguous in the specific ways it had always been ambiguous. The disclosure thresholds remained where they had been when Sen reviewed them. The research continued, year after year, and the documentation accumulated, and the compliance record grew longer. There was no follow-up audit. There was no instrument revision targeting the exemption language. There was no renewed motion in the third compliance chamber to revisit the findings of Case 2008-47. The conclave's 8-year effort had produced a review, and the review had produced a clean finding, and the clean finding had closed the matter in a way that could not be reopened without inventing grounds that did not exist in the record. The file had closed. It stayed closed. I have been asked by younger officers in the time since what we were actually building. They have read the summary documents. They know the categories. They can see the numbers, but they want to know what the numbers mean, what we were actually building inside those 47 facilities for 50 years. What the conclave was afraid of when they dispatched Sen, whether that fear was reasonable. I tell them what Ambassador Valdez told me, in a different context, a long time ago. I tell them, we were using the framework as a framework. We were building inside it. We built carefully, and we built patiently, and we built for a long time, and when someone came to check, everything we had built was documented and disclosed and found to be in compliance. If they want the number, the aggregate number, the one Sen sat with in the archive room, I tell them the legal team's summary is on file. The math is not complicated. Most of them do not need me to say the number. They have read enough to understand the shape of it. What I want to put in the record, at the end of all of it, is this. Dova Sen looked out a narrow window at ships sitting at anchor in an outer transit lane. She looked at them for a long time. She made a note. She went back to her work. She wrote 7 pages. She made her recommendation. She closed the inquiry. And in doing so, in writing what the evidence supported, in finding what was actually there rather than what she had been sent to find, she put into the Commission's permanent record a finding that said, clearly and in the most credible terms available, what we had spent 50 years building toward: full compliance, all 17 instruments, the most thorough documentation encountered in a 31-year career. Close the file. It closed. The work continued. That was enough. Let me be more specific about what the preparation looked like, because the preparation is part of what I am trying to put in the record. It is not separate from the story. It is the story, or most of it. We had, at the time of the audit, a compliance infrastructure that had been built incrementally over the full 50 years of Earth's participation in the treaty framework. It had not been built in anticipation of Seni specifically. It had been built in anticipation of exactly this, the moment when someone serious came to look, and we needed the record to speak for itself without any assistance from us. In my 6 years as senior compliance officer, I had inherited that infrastructure, understood it, extended it, and added to it. My predecessor had done the same. His predecessor before him. There was a continuity of intent across those decades that was not formally documented anywhere. There was no memo, no founding document, no institutional mission statement that said, We are building a compliance record that will survive the most serious examination the Commission can deploy against us. It was simply understood, by everyone in the role and everyone around the role, that this was what the work required. You built the record. You built it carefully. You built it against the instruments as written, not as interpreted favorably to you. You built it against the ambiguities, identifying where the language was unclear and documenting your assessment of how it resolved and why. You did not build it for the moment of crisis. You built it continuously, in the ordinary course of the work, because the moment of crisis would arrive eventually, and when it did, the record would be what it was. The preparation for Sen was not in that sense preparation, it was organization. We took the record we had built and organized it in a way that made it fully accessible to the most thorough examiner we expected to encounter. We annotated where annotation would help. We cross-referenced where cross-referencing would demonstrate the connection between the compliance position and the treaty language. We went back further than requested because going back further showed something that shorter records cannot show. Continuity, consistency, the same compliance posture, maintained to the same standard year after year after year. You cannot manufacture that kind of record in the 14 days before an examiner arrives. You can only produce it by having actually done the work. That was what we gave Sen, not a performance, the record itself. I want also to describe one of the outer settlement facilities more precisely, because the facilities are central to the story in a way that the compliance documentation is not, and because the way I think about them has changed somewhat in the years since the audit. The defensive application research installations were the largest category in the summary document by page count, which was partly a function of how broadly the category was defined, and partly a function of the actual scope of the work. They were not weapons programs. I want to be careful about that, because the phrase defensive application research has a specific meaning in treaty, compliance contexts, and I do not want it to be misread. The Meridian Protocols define the research exemption in terms of applications that are not directed at offensive capacity. They use a definition of offensive capacity that is somewhat technical, and that our legal team had analyzed in considerable depth. The defensive application work fell outside that definition under our legal team's assessment, and under any construction of the definition that treated the treaty language as governing what it said it governed. What the defensive application facilities were doing, in practical terms, was studying the gap between what we had disclosed as our current capabilities and what we would need to maintain the integrity of Earth block space against the full range of threats that the current galactic environment presented. They studied that gap scientifically. They did not close it. They were research installations, not production facilities. They identified it, characterized it, modeled it, and developed the theoretical foundations and the materials and the technical architectures that would allow the gap to be closed quickly if the need arose. None of that was a violation. None of it triggered a disclosure threshold. All of it was documented and made available on request. But when you stood in one of the larger facilities and looked at the scope of what was being modeled, the breadth of the scenarios being studied, the depth of the theoretical work, the sophistication of the materials being developed in anticipation of applications that had not yet been formally authorized, when you looked at it fully and understood what it represented, you understood something about the relationship between what we had disclosed and what we were capable of that was not, strictly speaking, in any treaty document. That was what Sene understood when she read the 30-page summary and the supplementary documents. Not that we had violated anything, that the distance between what we had disclosed and what the full compliance record implied was, in the honest measure of it, significant. She sat with that understanding. She filed it in the place where things outside the scope of an assignment are filed. She wrote her report. I have spent considerable time, in the years since, thinking about what it must have required of her to do that, to sit with that understanding and write only what the instruments required her to write, which was the compliance finding and the recommendation to close. To not insert into the findings the things she had understood that the instruments did not ask her to address, to write the 7 pages and walk away from the rest of it. That is a specific kind of professional discipline. The kind that comes from 31 years of doing the same thing with the same quality of commitment. You assess what you have been asked to assess. You find what the evidence supports. You write what you found. You close the file. You do not expand the scope beyond your authorization. You do not insert your own analysis of the broader implications into a record that was not constituted to receive it. You do your job, exactly your job, and you do it to the highest standard you are capable of. She did, and in doing it, she produced a record that was, from our perspective, exactly what we needed it to be, a clean compliance finding, from the most credible examiner available. filed in the Commission's permanent record and formally accepted by the Third Compliance Chamber. We could not have produced that record ourselves. A self-certified compliance assessment would have been challenged immediately. An assessment from a junior examiner would have been disputed. An assessment from a senior examiner, with a shorter or less distinguished record, would have been questioned. Only Sen's record was bulletproof, and Sen's record was bulletproof precisely because she wrote what she found, always had, and everyone in every institution that dealt with the Commission knew it. They had sent their best examiner to find a violation, their best examiner of full compliance. That finding was now in the Commission's permanent record under her name and her case number, and it would remain there for as long as the record was maintained. That is what 8 years of effort and 1 inquiry produced. I stayed in treaty compliance work for another 4 years after I left the Commission. Then I retired and spent some time traveling to the outer settlement clusters, not in any official capacity, just privately, visiting places I had seen only through audit reports and facility access logs. I visited a few of the 47 facilities as a private citizen. The administrators were courteous. They showed me around. Things had grown since the audit. New projects were running. New archives were filling. The documentation continued to accumulate. At one facility, the largest of the defensive application installations, in the Marin cluster, I stood in the main research hall and looked at the scale of what was being done, and thought about Sen standing in a smaller version of this same kind of room, and going still in the specific way she had gone still when the scope of it registered. I thought about the 7 pages, the clean compliance finding, the closed inquiry. I thought about the work continuing. I do not know what the conclave expected when they spent 8 years building toward that inquiry. I do not know what they told themselves they would find, or what they planned to do with the finding. I do not know if they understood, in the months after Sen filed her report and the inquiry closed, what the result of their effort actually was. Not a neutral outcome, not a failed attempt that left matters as they were before, but an active, positive result for the party they had targeted. A clean compliance finding on the public record, certified by the most credible examiner they could have deployed, covering 17 instruments and 35 days of unrestricted examination. A finding that said, in terms no future inquiry could easily contest, that Earth's treaty compliance was not merely adequate but exemplary. They had tried to produce a finding against us. They had produced instead the strongest possible endorsement of our compliance record. It was in the record now, under Sen's name, and it would stay there. I am not a person who takes satisfaction in other institutions' failures. I have been in this work too long for that kind of response. What I take from the Sen review, looking back at it across the years, is something quieter than satisfaction and more durable, a confirmation of something I had believed since early in my career but had not, until the review, seen tested at the level it was tested that year. The belief is simple. You build the record carefully, and you build it honestly, and you build it over a long time. You do not build it in anticipation of a specific threat. You build it in anticipation of the fact that a serious examination will eventually come, and when it does, the record will be what it is. If the record is what it should be, if it reflects the work you actually did, to the standard you actually maintained, over the time you actually maintained it, then a serious examination is not a threat. It is a confirmation. Sen was the most serious examination Earth's treaty compliance had faced. She confirmed the record. That was enough. There is one aspect of the review that I have described only briefly and that deserves more careful treatment, the character of the cooperation itself, and what Sen made of it as the 35 days progressed. An experienced examiner learns to read cooperation the way a doctor reads a patient's behavior in a consultation. There is the cooperation that is performed, the organization that is too neat, the answers that are too ready, the welcome that is too warm, and it communicates, to someone who has seen enough of it, that the party being examined has something specific it is managing around. There is the cooperation that is reluctant, the delays, the documents that require additional requests, the access that is technically granted but practically difficult, and that communicates, clearly enough, that there is something the party would prefer not to have found. And then there is the cooperation that is simply accurate, the record that is what it is, organized the way it should be organized, made available without ceremony or anxiety, ready for whatever examination requires. I had spent 6 years making certain that our cooperation, when it was finally required, would be of the third kind, not the first kind, not the performance of compliance, which reads as concealment just as clearly as actual concealment does. The third kind, the kind that communicates nothing except, here is the record, examine it, find what is there. I watched Sen recalibrate over the first week of the review, not dramatically. She was not a person given to dramatic recalibration, and she had seen too much in her career to be easily surprised. but I could see it in the specific quality of how she moved through the documentation. In the first days, she was reading with a particular vigilance, a heightened attention that was looking for the thing beneath the surface, the inconsistency, the gap, the place where the documentation went thinner than it should. She was doing her job the way her job required her to do it, which was not to trust the surface but to test it. After the first week, the quality of her attention shifted. She was still thorough. She was always thorough, but the vigilance had a different character. She was no longer testing the surface for what might lie beneath it. She had found that the surface held, and she was measuring the depth of it. That was the change I watched happen. And once it happened, the review took on a different quality entirely. It became, for the remaining weeks, less an interrogation of our compliance record and more a study of it. She was not looking for violations. She was looking at what we had actually built, and she was looking at it with the full seriousness that it deserved. I found that harder to watch than the interrogation phase, if I am honest. An interrogation you can manage. A serious, attentive study of the full scope of what you have built and what it represents. That is something else. That requires you to sit quietly while someone who is very good at understanding the implications of things takes the measure of something you have spent your career maintaining and extends that measure as far as it will go. She extended it as far as it would go. I watched her do it. I watched her read the summary document and the supplementary materials, and I watched her sit in the last week of the review with all of it and take the full measure. And I thought about Ambassador Valdez's instruction. Give her everything. Answer every question before she asks it. Make her job so complete that her report writes itself. And I understood, in a way I had not fully understood when Valdez had said it, what the instruction actually contained. It was not simply a strategy for managing the inquiry. It was a recognition of what the record actually was, and a decision to let the record be what it was without protecting it from examination, because the only thing that could threaten a record that was genuinely clean was the attempt to shield it from serious scrutiny. A clean record survives examination. It does not need protection. The act of protecting it is what creates the appearance of vulnerability. We had not protected it, we had opened it completely, and Sene had examined it completely. And the record was what it was. I have thought about what she wrote in that brief note, at the end of the long evening, looking out the window at the ships in the transit lane. I have thought about it more than any other single moment in the review, perhaps because it is the moment that is most opaque to me. The one thing in the whole of those 35 days that I could observe, but not know. Everything else I could read from the evidence. I could read the compliance findings from the documentation. I could read her understanding from the questions she asked and the moments when her attention shifted. I could read the direction of the inquiry from the supplementary document requests and the facility visits she prioritized. But the note is hers. I do not know what it says. I know what she was looking at when she wrote it, and I know the quality of attention she was bringing to the window before she returned to her work, and from those two things I have constructed several possible versions of what it might say, each of which seems like something a person of her experience and her discipline might write at that moment. Some of them are brief. Some of them are only a few words. One of them, the one I return to most often when I think about it, is simply the word enough, not as a judgment, not as a conclusion about whether the thing she had found was acceptable or not acceptable, just as a recognition. The word you write when you have taken the full measure of something, and the measure is complete, and you understand it in its completeness. She looked at the ships, she made a note, she went back to her documents, the inquiry closed, the record stood, the work continued. That is the record of it. I want to record one more thing about the outer settlement community, because it is relevant to the character of what Senna found, and I have not described it fully. The administrators and research directors at the 47 facilities were not, in the main, people with institutional connections to the treaty compliance work I did at the Commission. They were scientists and engineers and program directors who had spent their careers doing research in a remote and relatively unglamorous part of the settlement network, building facilities and running programs that operated under a legal framework most of them understood only in its practical implications. What you could do, what you had to document, and what would happen if you were ever examined. They were not lawyers. They were not diplomats. They had not spent years in the treaty apparatus the way I had, but they had built their documentation practices with a care that was, in some ways, more instinctive and more thorough than anything I had encountered in the formal compliance community. They had built it because they understood, from the practical experience of operating under a scrutinized exemption in a politically contested part of the galactic framework, that the documentation was the work, not separate from the work itself. You did not build something in a legal gray area and then document it afterward. You built the documentation as you built the thing, so that at every point in the construction of it you could show precisely what you had done, and why and how it related to the framework that authorized it. They had been doing that for decades before I arrived in the compliance role, and they were doing it still when Seni came through. When I contacted them before her visit and told them to prepare for a comprehensive examination, most of them told me, in various forms of the same statement, that their records were already prepared, that they had always been prepared, that the records were organized to the standard they maintained as a continuous practice, and that they did not need a specific examination date to bring them up to that standard because that standard was the operating standard every day, year over year. Sen found that when she visited, she found not just the documents but the habit behind the documents, the institutional culture of a research community that had internalized documentation as a fundamental practice rather than a compliance obligation. I could see her recognize it at the second facility she visited, which was an energy systems installation run by a director who had been in the role for 22 years. He walked her through the archive room the way someone walks a visitor through their own living space, not self-consciously, not performing, just moving through something familiar and letting the visitor see it for what it was. She spent a long time in that room. She asked the director several questions. He answered them with the ease of someone who has been answering those questions, in one form or another, for 2 decades. She thanked him with a brevity that I had learned by that point to read as the highest form of acknowledgement she offered. Then she asked me as we were leaving, how many of the 47 administrators had been in their roles for more than a decade. I told her, 31 of them. She did not respond to that. She walked to the transport and reviewed her notes for the next facility. 31 out of 47. A research community where the institutional knowledge of compliance practice had been accumulating in the same positions for a decade or more at a time, where the people who had built the documentation standards were still there to defend them and extend them, where the newest arrivals were trained by the people who had been doing it longest. That is the record behind the record. Not just the documents themselves, but the community that produced them and sustained them, and would go on producing and sustaining them long after. Sen's inquiry was a closed case number in the Commission's archive. She had examined the documents. She had found them excellent. She had written that finding. The community that produced them continued its work. I think that is the full measure of it.